So I'll now hand over to Lisa to give her lecture on the Grand Duke and the Merchant of Pisa. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that introduction. Let me just say that this is a story that I happened upon when I was doing probably the best job that I ever had in my life, working for the Medici Archive Project, researching Jewish documents. And I would like to say that this is an extraordinary program. It was funded by Eugene Grant, the research program on Jewish history and culture in early modern Europe. Unfortunately, Eugene Grant died several years ago, but the program continues, and it's really a fine program. So what was I working on? The idea was to research documents and to find everything I could about Jews in Florence and relations with the Grand Dukes. Now, my background is as a paleographer and a historian of Renaissance Italy. So what was I doing, you may ask? Researching Jews in Florence. Well, I happen to love researching and working in the archives. I've had a number of fellowships working on documents in the Archivio di Stato in Florence. This is the reading room that you can see up here with all these scholars bent over these documents. It looks very dull. I've got to tell you, it's the most exciting work in the world. It's so much fun. And so I was just thrilled when I was given this job. And my work started on this research project on researching documents, letters specifically from the Grand Duke to various of his ambassadors in the Archivio di Stato. The collection that I was researching is called the Medicio del Principato, the Medici Grand Ducal Archival Collection. There are over 4 million letters in this collection. They are collected within over 6,400 volumes, and they occupy 1 mile of shelf space. What you're looking at in this photograph is a picture of the archives when they were still located in the Uffizi, when the Uffizi were still office buildings, as part of the Uffizi project of the Grand Dukes. It was a place to keep all the archives of the Grand Duchy. It moved after the flood to the location where it's at today. It covers a 200-year span of history, so from the 16th through the 18th centuries, and it is really an extraordinary place to do research. However, if you're going to look for history of a specific group of people, and people that you don't have names to search, you don't have people who are like big on the world stage, how do you find them? When you set out to do this type of research, it can be looking like for a straw in a haystack, right? So I started out looking for my straws in the haystack here. And you'll see as I tell you about my research trajectory, just where it led me. After the Archivio di Stato, I went to the archives in Pisa, the Archiepiscopal Archive, located just right around from the Leaning Tower, features documents of the Pisan Inquisitor. And you'll see why that becomes crucial within this talk today. So you can see, for instance, here, this says Al Reverendo Padre Inquisitore di Pisa. And so these were denunciations and indeed inquisitorial documents that were collected in Pisa. Finally, my research took me to the archive of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly known as the Inquisition. This was something that, for some reason, when I see the Swiss guard standing here outside the building, I seem to remember him standing there with a rifle, but that might be my imagination. It was actually a charming place to do research, and you'll see I managed to find a lot of material here. Now, when I started doing research, the idea was, well, let's try to focus in on an important point in Florentine history where the Grand Dukes were very, very interested in the activities of Jews, and specifically the period when Ferdinando was Grand Duke and established the free port of Livorno. So just a little bit of preliminary information on Ferdinando before I start talking about his relationship with the Jewish community. He was not born to rule. He was one of 11 children of Eleonora di Toledo and Cosimo I. He was the fifth boy. So that just gives you an idea. He had very low expectations in terms of ever getting to rule Tuscany. When in the autumn of 1562, his mother Eleonora and two of his brothers died, that brought the number down to just two, just him and Francesco, because he had another brother who died in infancy. Instead, Ferdinando was marked out from an early age for a religious life. Just like in families of wealthy Florentines, if you had the older boy would inherit the family fortune or go into the family business, and the younger sons would be set out for the church. So if you were a Medici, you would be set out for a clerical career. But if you're a Medici, you're going to get an appointment to a cardinalate at the very least, and hopefully someday become a pope. So when he was 13 years old in 1563, Ferdinando becomes a cardinal. And this becomes very important later on when we see his dealings with the Vatican. This is a painting of him later than 13. You can see already he's got a little peach fuzz and a little mustachio going there. But here's Ferdinando, already a cardinal. Now, when this painting was painted in 1575, this guy, Cosimo I, the Grand Duke, had died the year before in 1574. Just two of the sons were left now. Here's Francesco, who was the Grand Duke after his father's death, and here's our man, Ferdinando. And these are other members of the Medici family represented with the Holy Family in this painting. So Ferdinando's chances are still remote, especially if his brother Francesco has heirs. But then, unexpectedly, in 1587, Francesco dies. It was a very strange kind of circumstance. He and his second wife, Bianca Capello, were doing alchemy experiments. They did a whole, experiments, and in his studiolo, Francesco liked to blend all different potions, and the two died of poison. And it's not certain whether it was a, chemical accident or whether it was quite deliberate. Some people say that his brother Ferdinando poisoned him. I can't weigh in on that, although my good friend Christina Strunk, who has done a lot of work on Christine of Lorraine, swears that if Ferdinando did not kill his brother, he was certainly awfully lazy about calling the doctor when Francesco got sick. So in any case, 1587, Francesco dies, and Ferdinando resigns the cardinalate the very next year in 1588 and throws off his cardinal robes to get married to Christine of Lorraine in 1589 and found a dynasty. So Ferdinando becomes Grand Duke of Florence, and he becomes a very innovative Grand Duke and does things for Florence and for Tuscany that were really quite unusual. He and Christine of Lorraine, let me just say that Christine of Lorraine was the granddaughter of Caterina de' Medici, and she inherited a lot of money, and she was a very, very strong and woman, very willful. And the two of them were kind of a power couple here in Tuscany. And one of their big projects was to really strengthen the economic, the financial strength of the Grand Duchy. And they did that by instituting the free port of Livorno, or Leghorn, as it was known in English. So Livorno became a bustling port where you could do business duty-free. And Ferdinando, in order to increase the business in Livorno, passed these so-called Livornine laws. The laws of Livorno, there was one set that he passed in 1591, and an even more forceful set of laws in 1593, permitting peoples from all over the world, from any background, any religious or ethnic background, to do business without interference from the government. In fact, with great support of the government, especially in the case of the Jews. You had the right as a foreigner, set out in these Livornine laws, to practice any religion. And you can see here on the right-hand side where it says, a tutti voi mercanti di qualsivoglia nazione, so merchants of any nation, Levantines, Ponentines, so people from the east and from the west, Spagnoli, Portoghesi, Spanish, Portuguese, Greci, Tedeschi, Greeks, Germans, Italiani, Hebrei, so Jews, Turchi e Mori, Turks and Moors, Armeni, Persiani, Armenians and Persians, e altri. Altri, by the way, also included English, because the English were Protestants at the time of the Counter-Reformation. It was not a given that the English would be given these, benefits and various permissions in trade. So in these Livornine laws, which were specifically directed among all these many nations and many people, specifically focused on the Jews. And you'll see this as we go on in the various ways that Ferdinando favored the Jews in his dealings with them. So in addition to the right to practice your religion, which was not a small thing during this period, you had the right for ownership of property, for self-government. So each of these communities could be ruled by their own local jurisdiction, by their own people. They were given especially favorable conditions for doing business, and protection from persecution was written into the laws as well. And for the Jews, very, very important was the fact that they would have freedom of movement. Residents in the city of Livorno and Pisa. Pisa was included in the Livornine laws. No ghettos would exist. Okay, this period that we're looking at was what is known as the age of the ghetto. The first ghetto was established in Venice in 1516. Afterwards, Pope Paul IV, in his bull Comnimus Absurdum in 1555, established the first ghetto in Rome, and then there was Ancona and Bologna, and a whole slew of all the ghettos that developed within Italy began at that point. By you can find that lecture that is posted on the British Institute YouTube page. But the first ghetto the ghetto of Florence was founded in 1571, just near the Piazza della Repubblica. So you can see in this painting of Stradanos. However, these two cities, Pisa and Livorno, here's the anglicized version, which is Leghorn, were not places, no ghettos existed in these places. Now, Pisa had been a long-standing Jewish community. I don't want to go back to the whole story of the Jews in Italy. I dealt with that in my last lecture. Jews had been in Italy from the time of Julius Caesar and before. And Pisa was a very well-established Jewish community. Livorno, though, was a new town. It was a port, and it was this project of Ferdinando and Christine's. Livorno ends up becoming a huge center of trade, and it becomes the second largest population of Sephardic Jews in early modern Europe, second only to Amsterdam. So it's very, very important. There were fewer than 1,000 Jews in 1591 when the Livornine laws were first passed. By the late 18th century, there were over 40,000, however. The population really grew. So this community in Livorno and Pisa, and I'm going to be focusing on Pisa today because I want to tell you the story of this merchant of Pisa that I've named this talk after, was very, very well established and supported deeply by the Grand Duke. Now, I just want to share with you, just to kind of flavor this talk before I mention Esperial, the so-called merchant of Pisa, to read you from one of the letters that the Grand Duke wrote to his ambassador Niccolini in Rome. This is in March of 1595. He says, "You've got to explain to the Pope that we have a special rule here." And he says, "Our tolerance of them, that is our tolerance of the Jews, is not founded on any taxes or participation in usury or money that we obtain from them. They don't pay us a penny. They are tolerated by us only for the public service of the port of Livorno and to introduce trade into Pisa. So non pagandoci pure un sol quattrino, the Jews don't pay us anything. And he goes on to say, other places in Italy where there are Jewish communities, the rulers take a big cut and charge the Jewish people who live there a fees, for every privilege they get. He says, we're not tolerating them for mercenary reasons. We don't make them pay. Non gli facciamo pagare, né gli vendiamo questa tolleranza, nor do we sell them this tolerance, come gli altri. We don't sell them tolerance. And to me, that was such a striking phrase. And I thought this is a very interesting perspective in 16th century Europe that is being expressed by Ferdinando I. So I wanted to see where this came from, his attitude, and if it really played out, if it was just so much rhetoric, or if it was something that he really lived by. Okay, when I started looking at the documents, I started noticing this word everywhere. This is at the very end of the letter here, signed by Ferdinando. And he says that I'll make sure to see that nobody is persuaded to apostatare, to commit apostasy. Apostasy is an issue that starts showing up a lot in these documents. The two words I kept finding over and over again were circumcisione, circumcision, and apostasia. And I'll show you examples of both in a moment. So apostasy, that is turning back to your old religion, renouncing the religion that you have professed, was a big issue at this time in Counter-Reformation Italy. Apostasy of conversos, or new Christians, was one of the most serious offenses that could be within the Inquisition. So Jews that had converted to Christianity, in other words, in order to be a Jew and to continue living, to not be, killed, to be massacred, or to be expelled from Europe, you had to convert to Christianity and become a converso, or converted person. So the idea of Jews living as Jews, for instance, in the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th century, in the late 15th century, was a non-starter. In 1483 and 1492, as part of the Reconquista, Jews were expelled from Spain. You could only stay if you converted, if you became a converso. In Portugal, it was even worse. In 1497, there were the forced conversions of the Jews. That is, you converted or you died. That was your choice. So if you wanted to continue living, you became a new Christian. In 1506, though, that was proven to not even be sufficient. There was a horrible Lisbon massacre on April 19th, when hundreds of Jews were just massacred, even though they had converted. So by the 1590s, when it came to the ears of these conversos that there was a possibility to live in Tuscany, in Livorno or Pisa, and to profess the Jewish faith, because one of the things Ferdinando included that was very important in his Livornine laws was you could practice any faith, and indeed it was permitted to return to the Jewish faith. So by the 1590s, there was a huge Jewish immigration to Tuscany. And that's what we see, this whole wave of a Jewish population coming to Livorno and Pisa. So this, just to go back now a little bit, in the 1590s, when Cardinal Santa Severina, who was for 30 years the most feared and powerful head of the Inquisition in Rome, writes to Grand Duke Ferdinando the following words. You would expect Ferdinando to be shaking in his boots. The Cardinal Santa Severina writes, these past months, it has come to the attention of the Holy Father, that is the Pope, that living in Pisa are many Jews who were born, baptized, and raised in the Holy Christian faith. Then, through diabolical instigation, they renounced it and made themselves Jews, and they publicly live as such, causing great scandal to the faithful. Many of these Jews who grew up Christian, this is still Santa Severina writing to the Grand Duke, as adults came to Pisa, and there they have had themselves circumcised and become Jews. All day long, they go around trying to tempt and persuade other Christians to commit similar errors and crimes. For this reason, His Holiness has expressly ordered me in his name to write to your Highness, begging you kindly to give the order that in the name of the Holy Office, the persons named in the enclosed list be incarcerated. And he includes a whole list of Jews living, especially in Pisa, who are to be arrested. And to give the order that other Portuguese and Spanish Jews not be allowed to leave Pisa. So you'd expect Ferdinando to turn these people over right away and, to do the Pope's bidding. He does not. He comes up with excuses and he writes letters such as the one that I read to you before, where he says, here we treat our Jews well, and they're, part of the business project here in Livorno and Pisa. And if I see any cases of circumcision or apostasy, I'll let you know. But of course he doesn't. Okay, so moving forward then to 1600, you'll have to excuse me if I go back and forth, because as I discovered these documents, I was kind of moving back and forth as well. So on September 23rd of 1600, Ferdinando wrote to his admiral in Livorno, and he told him that there was going to be a man called Andrada, who was a Jewish royal merchant coming from Bordeaux. And we don't know exactly when this man arrived, but it was sometime either in late 1600 or early 1601. He may even have come on the ship that took Maria de' Medici to France to become the wife of Henry IV, because Ferdinando's niece, Maria de' Medici, had just married the King of France. But we don't know that for a fact. The man's name, this important royal merchant, is Jacob Esperial. However, you learn very fast when you're doing research on Jewish history that the names that Jews carry are almost like clothes that can be changed and shed depending on the context. So he's also known as Diego d'Andrada. Sometimes he's known as Andrado, sometimes d'Andrade or Londrade. So it depends where he's moving around. We know that he was originally of Portuguese origins, but he had been based in Bordeaux with a lot of business ties with Lyon. I have to tell you right off that I was never able to find the exact business that he was involved in. He was extraordinarily wealthy, I can tell you that. And he was so highly placed that when he got in trouble with the Inquisition, as we're going to see, he's not only defended by the Grand Duke of Tuscany, but also the King of France sends his ambassadors in as well. Okay, regardless of that, Jacob Esperial arrives in Tuscany with his wife, Raquel. He has two daughters, Rosa and Esther, more about them in a moment, and his sons, David, Joseph, and Isaac. And the year after he arrives, he buys a home in the Via Ferdinanda in Pisa. So the family is very, very well established and presumably is planning on staying a while. In May of 1602, so this is just a year after Esperial has arrived, a man as important as Esperial clearly doesn't just sneak in to the city of Pisa. The authorities have been alerted, and Ferdinando writes to his ambassador in Rome saying, Esperial was born a Jew in Salonika and had always lived as a Jew and had never been a Christian. Ferdinando knew the truth. He knew that Esperial came from France. He had communications with the French king, who, after all, had just married Ferdinando's niece. This is the official line that Ferdinando is telling his representative in Rome to tell the Inquisition. He wants to get the Inquisition off of Esperial's back. So the whole background of Portugal, if you came from Portugal or Spain, all bets were off because you were a de facto Jew, because anybody who was practicing Judaism in Tuscany and came from Portugal was an apostate and would be in trouble. So I then went through volumes of these letters of secretaries of the Grand Duke to the Tuscan ambassador in Rome. These span from 1601 to 1604. When I started this research, there were no documents about this man or his case. By the time I finished, I was able to enter nearly 100 documents that concerned Esperial and his representatives. Now, you'll notice when you look at this document, there's all kinds of little numbers. It's a coded message. This message, and by the way, I took so much teasing from my colleagues at the Medici Archive Project when I was working on these documents, because I was like there with my secret decoder ring when I was reading them. Mostly when you read documents that are ciphered, that are written in some sort of code in the Archivio di Stato, some diligent secretary for the Grand Duke has gone in and deciphered it before, so you've got this interlinear deciphering. Well, that was not the case. No one had deciphered these documents. So I had to page they have volumes. The Medici kept all of their codes with their decipherings, and I had to one by one go through them. Documents like this, which were numerical codes with added dashes and dots that you had to go through. I was able to locate very early on this word. 7, 8, and then an 8 with a dot above it and a 7, 5 is Ebreo. So whenever I would scan all these numbers, if I saw 7, 8, 8.75, I knew that I had a document worth going through. And then very meticulously, I would go through them. And as you can see, when you look at this line of code, there's no spaces or commas or punctuation. So this says, ricercato di far mettere in prigione in Pisa un ebreo. He tried to put a Pisan in, a Jew in prison in Pisa. So these are the type of documents that I had to look at to find the material I did about the Grand Duke protecting these Jews. In one of these documents, there's a letter from the Tuscan ambassador Niccolini to a secretary for the Grand Duke in Florence in October of 1602. And he says that they found out in the Inquisition that Esperial had been baptized. And the information is the Inquisition has resolved to condemn him, and whoever wanted to help the Jew, in my judgment, ought to warn him as soon as possible that he give orders for all his goods that he possesses in the Kingdom of Spain, as well as its subject states, be removed or protected, because they will be taken from him. However, already at the beginning of the month, Esperial had left. He left Tuscany and went to Venice. A couple of times he picks up and he just goes, he had that information already. Did he get it through official channels of the Grand Duke? It's very possible. In any case, they did not catch Esperial, but they were on the lookout for him. They went to look for him through his children. And this is a document I found in the Pisan archives. This is in November of 1603. It's a interrogation of Raquel, that's Esperial's wife, and his youngest son, Isaac. So first is the interrogation. This is on the 24th of November, 1603. I'm sorry, it's so pale that you can barely read it. But you can see, Donna Raquel, moglie di Jacob Esperial. So this is the actual dictated interrogation of both mother and son. First the mother and then the son. I'm sorry, it's so pale, but this is what the volume looked like that I had to go through. Okay, so I'm going to translate this for you into English. Those of you who read Italian, feel free to read along the Italian as I go. What I love about these documents, what makes them so exciting, is that you actually get a feeling of how well prepared both mother and son were and how sharp they were in answering these very pointed inquisitorial questions. So the first thing, Raquel is asked to say her full name and where she came from. So she says, my name is Raquel, the wife of Jacob Esperial. First, I was in Rochelle, that is La Rochelle, then in Paris, Bordeaux, and then in Lyon. Then the inquisitor asks, how long were you in France? And did you have any other name that you used in France to hide the fact that you were a Jew? And she says, I said that in France, they shouldn't call me anything but by my husband's name, that is Esperial, right? And even less did I frequent Christians. At home, I was known as Donna Raquel, and outside they called me Madame d'Andrada. Then the inquisitor says, how many times did you attend Mass in France and where? So it's kind of like that question, that leading question, like, when did you stop beating your wife? It's, and she's meant to be caught in the net. And she says, I went about 2 times to hear preaching and sermons, but I never went to mass. Even though sometimes when I passed by the church, I entered through one door and I went out through the other. So she's really being, very careful in her answers. In case somebody had seen her in church, she'll say, I was just slipping through. The inquisitor says, and when you were inside the church, did you ever kneel? Did you ever show any sign of being a Christian? Like, did you cross yourself? And she says, I never kneeled and I never made any sign of reverence. And you'd think this would be bad, right? To say you didn't make reverence, but that would have caught her as posing as a Christian if she had. The inquisitor says, then why did you go to church? And how does she answer? She says, out of curiosity. And I went very few times. He asks then another one of these leading questions. Who was your confessor in Lyon and in Bordeaux? And Raquel says, I never confessed. And I'm very amazed because we Jews never go to confession. Like, you should know that, Inquisitor, right? Like, duh. And then the Inquisitor says, and how were you in Lyon? It's a Catholic city and everyone in there is very faithful. And everyone who lives in Lyon is forced to confess and to go to take communion in their parish, which was true at Lyon at the time. And Raquel says, in all of France, I never ever took communion and I never confessed anywhere in France. And then he said, did you have any of your children with you in France? She says, with me were David, Joseph, and Isaac, her sons, not the daughters. And the inquisitor says, and how were your sons called? And she said, everybody outside the house called them Monsieur d'Andrada, but in the house, they were called by their first names. And then at the end, she kind of makes an X and she signs her confession or her interrogation, excuse me. On the same day, there was the interrogation of Isaac. And here you can see his signature, Io Isaac Esperiel. So 13 years old, he has a very nice hand and he signs his interrogation. Isaac says, I was born in Bordeaux and I always was in France until I was 3 years old. And then we came to Italy. The inquisitor says, did you go to school or were you with Christians? Isaac says no, because as I said, my father kept a teacher for me at home and he taught me at home how to read and write. The inquisitor said, did you frequent other Christian children? Isaac says, yes, I did hang out with a lot of children in our neighborhood of my age. The inquisitor says, and how did those children call you? What did they call you, your name? He says, Petit Andrado, which means little Andrado. So he answers very easily the question. And he asks then, did you ever go to mass in the company of those children? Isaac says, no. And my rabbi yelled at me a lot whenever he saw me hanging out with those kids. And he then signs the document. Raquel and Isaac are allowed to leave. They have to pay 500 silver scudi bail, promising that they won't leave Pisa. In the meantime, a very worrying letter arrives to Florence, to the Grand Ducal Court. The news is that the inquisitor has been with me just now. This is the ambassador from the Tuscan ambassador in Rome, saying that since that Jew, Jacob Esperiel, has been released to go about freely in Florence, Pisa and Livorno on the bail of 1,000 scudi. So here we see Jacob Esperiel Ebreo. Since he's been released to go about bail, they've decided to seize 2 of his children because they know Esperiel is so wealthy that he could up and leave that 1,000 scudi behind. So we have 2 suoi figli, 2 of his children are to be arrested. And indeed, the Florentine inquisitor writes to Ferdinando I on the 23rd of March of 1604, same year, and says that he is ordering to capture, catturare quelle donne, to capture those women. Then we have the news, and this, I thought when I read this letter, that we had reached the end of the line for Esparel and his family. I thought for sure the daughters were toast at this point, because Pope Clement VIII writes this letter to Ferdinando in May of 1604. And in this letter, basically the jig is up. He says, Jacob Esparel for many years was in Bordeaux and Lyon, calling himself Diego d'Andrada, living as a Christian with his family, taking the holy sacraments, baptizing his children, hearing mass, and when his father died in Bordeaux, he had him buried in the cloister of the Augustine friars. The inquisitor had ordered Esparel and his children to be captured. Esther, wife of Joseph Esparel, so here's Esther, moglie di Gioseffo. And we learn later on, because Ambassador Niccolini specifies not just Esther, but also Rosa, figliola d'Esparel. So both Rosa, who's the wife of Dr. Moise, and Esther, or here written Hester, have been captured. And so when I got to this, my heart was beating. In 1604, I thought the two women are in the clutches of the Inquisition. They were taken to Rome. In the inquisitorial documents within the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, I saw all of the records. Well, I can't say all because it's very spotty. There's a lot of documents missing from the inquisitorial record there. But both of the women were in custody. They were both pregnant at the time, and they were in particularly ill health, according to the inquisitors' records. And I thought this was the end. I thought it was going to end very badly. As a matter of fact, it doesn't end badly. There are no more documents about Esparel and his family in the records of the Inquisition, or indeed among the Secretariat of the Grand Duchy during this period. And Esparel and his family go on to thrive. They continue living in Pisa. The family lives in Pisa for generations afterwards. In fact, I even was able to trace them to the 19th century, where they had moved from Pisa to Piombino. So they remained local in Tuscany, and they were very well established. I can only think that, Santa Severina had died later in 1602. So the inquisitor who was really behind much of this was off the scene. And as well, the Pope had died in 1605. So there was sort of a change of the guards, and I'm sure money changed hands, and Esparel and his family were safe. I don't have time to go into all the other documents that I've seen. I will show you the articles. I'll give you citations for the articles that I wrote about this, where I have many more documents where we have proof of Ferdinando hearing about the whereabouts and the doings of Jewish citizens in his cities of Livorno and Pisa, and refusing to turn them over. And in fact, lying, just bold-faced lies to the Pope. We can only expect that Ferdinando, all those years that he was cardinal in Rome, he was learning the ins and outs of the Vatican. And he had lots of friends in high places, and he knew how to get around the powers that be. Okay, so in my last lecture on the Jews in Florence, I spoke about Manasseh ben Israel, so I'm not going to speak about him today, but this is the pamphlet that he wrote to Lord Cromwell, asking, that the Jews be readmitted to England, and indeed the Livornine laws of Grand Duke Ferdinando be applied in England. So favorable were they to commerce and to Jewish livelihood. The city of Livorno really has a fascinating history. This is a golden coin from 1655, coined representing the port and city of Livorno. And around the border, around here, it says, diversis gentibus una, out of many peoples one, which has kind of an interesting resonance for American history. The idea of the Enlightenment values that began in Pisa during this time and in Livorno continue throughout the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. In the article that I wrote about this, this episode between Ferdinando I and Jacob Esparel, I emphasized that word tolerance that Ferdinando uses actually in a number of letters to the Pope, not just on that one occasion. And tolerance is really something that is not to be underestimated in early modern Europe. by the 18th century, the Medici were no longer the Grand Dukes of Florence. It had gone to the Alsace-Lorraine branch of the family. But under Grand Duke Pietro Leopoldo, the precepts of Cesare Beccaria were applied, and capital punishment was abolished in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany on the 30th of November, 1786. This is before the French came up with their, amazingly, enlightened use of the guillotine to execute people, right? So we're seeing in this counter-Reformation Catholic nation in Italy within the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, an amazing example of, tolerance and welcoming of foreigners and of different customs. And I think it's a chapter in European history that really needs to be studied more closely. I'm very proud to say that, Tuscany was the very first European country to abolish capital punishment. So if you want more information on any of these things I've talked about, you can go to the database of the Medici Archive Project, and you can see the documents that I've entered with the transcriptions and translations, and other documents that have to do with Jews in the early modern period here in Tuscany. You can also look for my article if you want. We do not sell them tolerance. Grand Duke Ferdinando I's protection of Jews in Tuscany in the case of Jacob Esperiel. These also on my website, lisakaborycha.com, under resources, I've given a big bibliography if you want to do more readings along these lines. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this talk, and I'm going to open up the floor now to questions from the people here in the audience and those at home as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lisa. We're trying to get the lights on. Avoid a chance. Well, there you go. Got it. Yeah. Okay, we'll put that one back on.
Yeah.
All right.
Enlightenment.
So thank you very much, Lisa. And as is always the case, we'll do questions in the room and also on the Zoom. If you're on the Zoom, please feel free to put something in the chat. I'll open it up so we can have a look at it. And also, if you would prefer, you could just unmute yourself and speak. But I see I've got one question in the room already. I'll bring the microphone over.
Well, thank you very much. This is a wonderful lecture, number one. The question I have, we know that Jews have been persecuted over the ages. And did you find in your research any reason why the Jews were being persecuted during that time?
That's a great question. It all goes back to the issue of apostasy that I was talking about. If you break your oath to somebody, that's a bad thing, right? They can take you to court, you can get in trouble. You don't want to break your word. But if you break an oath to God, that's really important. And from the Inquisition's point of view, here in the Vatican, in Rome, it was considered the worst possible crime, because after all, the Jews that had converted to Christianity were welcome, and the papacy was very happy to have them in Italy, and even the act of enclosing Jews in ghettos was more of the idea was to contain them, which I guess we could talk about that as a type of persecution as well. But it was going back on your oath. It was returning to your prior faith that was considered so evil. And I think you could get from that document that Santa Severina wrote when he said that they're going around and they're recruiting more people, and they're going around and convincing other people to become Jews, as if, they were going and proselytizing everywhere. So that really is the immediate reason. Now, the larger reason for persecution of Jews is a much bigger question, right? So I'm just dealing with the immediate one in Counter-Reformation.
Another one here.
What kind of punishment could the merchant and his family have expected if they'd confessed or been condemned?
Well, what kind of punishment would they have expected? Well, for sure, all of the goods would have been seized. In fact, I've seen the documents where at the port in Pisa, they actually requisitioned and locked all of the goods belonging to Esperiel. At the worst, they could be put to death. Apostasy was a serious crime, and people ran for their lives when they knew that the Inquisition was after them for that crime. How many were especially put to death? I do not have that number at my fingertips.
You got one at the back?
It was a great lecture. Given the understanding that the development of Livorno and Pisa was based on developing an economic base, what economic value did the Jews bring if they were in no way taxed or there was no connection to money? There must have been some financial gain.
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the issues that I really raise in my article is the birth of the concept of mercantilism within the state of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. The Jews brought a number of things. In addition to this great amount of money that Esparel had, obviously that's of interest. It was the connections. The Jews, especially the Levantine Jews, had this great communication throughout the Mediterranean and the Levant with the communities of, Arab communities in the Middle East, and they were able to trade with great facility across various cultural differences, something that was not so easy always for Christians to do. So there was a great advantage to have this movement and these intermediaries between cultures, and which Jews were able to provide. Now, in addition to the mercantile interest, I did see one interesting document that kind of indicated to me that there are other reasons that the Jews were very important, that when there were Christians who were seized by Arab pirates or by various corsairs throughout the Mediterranean, Jews often worked as intermediaries as well, diplomatically. It wasn't always easy for Christians to negotiate the release of their prisoners, of their hostages. So there was that function as well. There was another document that I saw in terms of your question about merchants. There was one where the Grand Duke had sort of sent out scouts to the area of Milan to look for potential Jews to move to either Pisa or Livorno. And the Grand Ducal representative wrote back to Ferdinando saying, the Jews here are all very, very good businessmen, very astute. They're very good citizens. They all are very respectful. This is a very well-established community. We want these citizens. So there were many levels at which there was the pure mercantile, the idea of people who are good at trading and know how to make connections across cultures. There's also the negotiating diplomatically, but there was also kind of an intangible aspect of the kind of get up and go entrepreneurship that this community was viewed to possess at a time when, Renaissance, the impetus of the merchants from the 15th and 16th century in Florence had sort of lost their oomph. Is that a follow-up question you wanted?
Sorry, John.
I've been reading a book called The Verge. I don't know if you've heard of it, New York Times bestseller, but in any event, it focuses on 1492 to 1520 and says the basic mercantile structure of modern day trade, et cetera, states, monies, et cetera, was established during that time. There was a family called Jacob Fugger. Okay. And they were very, very important in establishing the concept of lending money through trade. They made their money through trade. Huge network all over Europe, Asia, Asia, certainly Constantinople and beyond. And they loaned the money. They were one of the few entities that could loan the money to the kings and the princes so they could wage war.
Right.
War created the consolidation of states. Does the relationship of having money that could be loaned to the leadership of these principalities in Livorno or Pisa, I mean,
Sure doesn't hurt, right?
Well, from this book's perspective, if it ain't the money, it's the money. And the Jewish communities and the establishment of states having money was huge in establishing stability, identity of nationalism,
Right.
the ability to draw borders, which allowed you to define trade, which allowed you to raise taxes. I mean, it's not because you're a good guy and you're tolerant. It's
Right.
because there were really definitive reasons.
Yeah. Okay. 2 points I would like to make. Thank you. That's really wonderful. The first is that you're right. It's not just that Ferdinando was a good guy and he was tolerant. I mean, I think I already suggested that he might have killed his own brother in order to become Grand Duke. So, you know, we're not talking about Mr. Nice Guy. And there's definitely, you know, money at stake. There's mercantile interests and there's huge amounts of money to be made. In terms of the banks and the banking interests, I don't know if you were at my talk that I gave about the Jews in the Renaissance. If you go back to that one on YouTube, I talked a lot about the many Jewish banks in Florence and the way the Medici family and the Jews sort of were symbiotic. And the Medici family was very, very supportive of the Jewish banking interests in Florence. In fact, they were able to play off the Jewish bankers against their local Florentine competitors, and they liked that very much. So you're absolutely right. Money was at stake here. So if I gave the impression that we're just talking about, sort of pie in the sky ideas about, goodness and light, I want to say that that's a sort of epiphenomenon of these really basic mercantile interests, as you so well pointed out.
We've got one up in the comments from Rosalind Lowe. Were there other cities in Italy where there were no ghettos?
Were there other cities in Italy where there were no ghettos? That's hard to, it's probably easier to say where the ghettos were than where there were no ghettos. I know that the Pope went back and forth on the port of Ancona because originally after Rome, Ancona and Bologna were turned into, ghettos were made. And then he kind of went back on that. And in fact, the ghetto in Bologna was then dissolved. There were many cities where there were ghettos that the walls were very permeable. There's a very good article by Ravid about the permeability of these ghetto walls. The fact that, during the day, Jews and Gentiles came and went. And because you had a ghetto didn't necessarily mean people were entirely enclosed all the time. In terms of actual, declaring this rule, Tuscany was unique. For instance, Venice, which had a very well-established Jewish community, and the literature on the Venetian ghetto is immense. In Venice, they had favorable conditions for Jews to trade, but the idea of apostasy was absolutely unacceptable. And even the Venetian Inquisition, which was not responsible to Rome, they had their own Inquisition, cracked down on apostates. So it's interesting that, Tuscany is really a unique situation in terms of putting it on paper and writing.
Very interesting. Before we go on, I'm just going to put in my weekly reminder that we're delighted to see many people zooming in from all over the world. Access to these lectures by Zoom is free of charge, but we do encourage you to make a donation of whatever size you feel comfortable to help us to keep this series going. I'm sorry you can't have the wine, which the people in the room are going to enjoy in a bit, but we love having you on the Zoom. Any more questions coming in from the Zoom? Does anyone want to unmute and say something? We can hear you. No, and in the room, have we got some more questions? Yeah, we got one there.
I want to go back to Livorno, 1492, and remember one Spanish family, Jewish family, Castelnuovo. They were Castilla Nueva. They had to run away from Spain for the,
Yes.
as you mentioned, and they settled here and they made a tremendous progress as bankers. And I remember one Castelnuovo, Mario, was a musician, a very successful musician until 1938, when Mussolini's racial laws pushed him away from Italy and he had to end up in California, Hollywood, where he became a great teacher of people who wrote soundtracks for the Metro Goldwyn Mayer. Sorry?
Castelnuovo Tedesco.
Castelnuovo Tedesco, yes, indeed. Thank you.
Yeah. It's ironic, after so many years of the Jews being well established here in Livorno, then being persecuted again. Yeah.
Okay, any more for any more? I think we're getting towards the end, at the top of the hour. Going, gone. Okay. Just remains, there's one there. Yes, Penny, go for it.
Hello. Hi, Lisa. Just wanted to say hi and thanks again. Brilliant lecture. Really loved it. And I was just writing something, so I thought I'd just call in and say hi. So thanks very much. Good to see you.
Nice to have you
It's nice seeing
remotely.
some friends from the art history
I think
class.
you were in the room last week, Penny, so you're moving.
I was, yes, and hopefully 2 weeks' time again.
Well, we'll still have some wine for you when you get back. I think it's probably time to say good night to the Zoomers. But before we do that, I'll thank on behalf of all of you,
Not that
Lisa, for a really excellent lecture. It was fascinating to see right inside your research and looking at the original documents. What a great piece of work that was. I mean, what a lot of fun. And what an interesting story as well. And it's nice to live in Florence because Florence remains essentially quite a progressive city. Not everyone knows that Florence is probably in the lead in Italy and in one of the leaders in Europe in terms of greening the city agenda, getting serious about making an environmentally sustainable city. So that's something to be applauded from our comune, which I think currently we have a very good city government who are doing their best to take Florence forward. So this internationalism and this tolerance in Tuscany has some good roots, which is really good to hear about. So thanks, Lisa, on behalf of all of us. That was a great lecture. Thank you. We'll say good night to the Zoomers. And then for those in the room, it is as